The moment Donald Trump saw the Saturday Night Live parody, his face turned an alarming shade of red. His jaw clenched and his fingers twitched as he gripped his phone, already composing a furious response. The skit, a mocking reenactment of his recent meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, had portrayed him as indifferent, dismissive, even outright hostile. J.D. Vance had been depicted as his obedient lapdog, nodding along as Trump scoffed at Ukraine's military aid requests. Worst of all, Elon Musk, wielding a comically oversized chainsaw, had burst into the scene, proclaiming himself the true leader of the free world. The audience had roared with laughter. Trump was seething. Within seconds, his fingers were pounding furiously at his phone screen. The worst, most disgraceful hit job in TV history. Totally fake news. Sad. The post went up on Truth Social in all caps, and his outrage only grew as he scrolled through the responses. His supporters were fuming on his behalf, but the media was eating it up. SNL ruthlessly mocks Trump in brutal parody, read one headline. Another simply said, Trump melts down over comedy sketch. The thought of being laughed at, ridiculed in front of millions, was unbearable. He didn't just want to rant, he wanted action. He fired off another post. NBC should apologize immediately. Where is the FCC? Where is the justice? Total election interference. Investigate. Inside Mar-a-Lago, his closest advisors watched nervously as Trump's fury escalated. J.D. Vance, standing a few feet away, exchanged an uneasy glance with a staffer. They had all learned that trying to reason with Trump in a moment like this was like trying to stop a hurricane with an umbrella. Aides scrambled to intervene, murmuring suggestions to de-escalate, to shift focus back to his campaign. But Trump wasn't interested. He ranted about how the late-night show had been out to get him for years. How Alec Baldwin had played him with disgusting, nasty bias, and now this new guy was even worse. Unwatchable garbage, he declared, pacing the room as staff members stood frozen, unsure whether to nod or stay silent. Then came the inevitable demand. He needed a press conference. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. He wanted cameras. He wanted the media to see his rage in real time. The advisors hesitated, hoping he would cool down, but the former president was already barking orders. Within the hour, Mar-a-Lago staff scrambled to set up the impromptu event. The press was notified. Reporters, sensing blood in the water, arrived in droves, eager to ask not just about the SNL skit, but about the deeper issue at hand, Trump's treatment of Ukraine, his relationship with Zelensky, and whether the parody had struck closer to the truth than he wanted to admit. As Trump adjusted his red tie in the mirror, his reflection staring back with a mixture of defiance and irritation, he was unaware that this press conference would only make things worse. The stage was set for a spectacle. And as always, Trump was ready for battle, whether he was prepared to win it was another matter entirely. The Mar-a-Lago press room hummed with anticipation. Cameras were rolling, microphones poised, and reporters exchanged knowing glances as they checked their notes. The air was thick with the scent of opportunity, an unscripted, unfiltered Trump moment was about to unfold. Trump entered the room with a scowl so deep it could have carved a trench into his face. His usual bravado was present, but there was an unmistakable edge to his movements, a barely contained fury simmering beneath the surface. As he stepped up to the podium, he made no attempt at pleasantries. There were no customary hand gestures meant to project confidence, no half-hearted smiles. He was here for war. He wasted no time launching into his grievances, railing against Saturday Night Live with the force of a man who believed he had suffered a great injustice. The show, he declared, was not comedy but an instrument of deep state propaganda, a calculated attack designed to weaken him in an election year. He painted himself as a victim of a corrupt media machine, one that had been working tirelessly to destroy him since the day he announced his candidacy years ago. The familiar script continued, his enemies were out to get him, the left-wing elites in Hollywood were terrified of his return, and the fake news media, sitting in front of him now, were complicit in spreading lies. He demanded accountability. He hinted at legal repercussions. He even floated the idea that SNL should be investigated for spreading misinformation that interfered with democracy. For a few moments, he had control. He had the floor, uninterrupted, his voice filling the room with righteous indignation. But then the journalist struck back. The first question cut straight to the heart of the matter: did Trump truly believe the parody was an attack, or was he simply enraged because it had mirrored reality too closely? The second came just as fast, pressing him on whether his real-life treatment of Zelensky had been as dismissive as the skit had portrayed. Others followed in rapid succession, each chipping away at his narrative of victimhood and replacing it with an image he desperately wanted to avoid, that of a leader who had openly mocked an ally at war. Trump bristled. His body stiffened, and his hands, once motioning dramatically to emphasize his points, now gripped the podium like a lifeline. He tried to brush off the questions, insisting that nobody had been tougher on Russia than him. He recited a well-worn list of sanctions, military aid packages, and NATO funding increases, but the reporters were relentless. They reminded him of his dismissive remarks during his meeting with Zelensky, the smirk he had worn as the Ukrainian president pleaded for more aid, the thinly veiled jabs about gratitude and respect. They pointed out that even some of his usual allies had been uncomfortable with his conduct, that the clip of the meeting had circulated widely and was now being played side by side with the SNL parody, real footage blending seamlessly with satire, making the distinction almost impossible to draw. Trump attempted to shift gears, derailing the conversation with a broad attack on Joe Biden. He ranted about how the current administration had mishandled Ukraine, how under his leadership there would have been no war, no destruction, no problems. He painted himself as the true champion of peace, the only one capable of stopping the conflict, but the press wasn't letting him off the hook. The next question was sharp and direct: did he regret the way he had treated Zelensky? Did he feel any responsibility for how his remarks had been received? Trump faltered for a brief moment, his lips tightening as if he were physically restraining himself from lashing out. Then, as expected, he dodged. He spoke of how strong his relationship with Ukraine had always been, how much support he had given them, how no one had done more. But the cracks in his defense were showing. His voice had taken on a slightly strained quality, his responses growing more circular, more detached from the reality unfolding around him. The journalists knew it. They could sense the moment when his bluster began to wane, when the bravado could no longer mask the discomfort beneath. The questions kept coming, each one pulling him further into a corner. The energy in the room shifted. The press conference had begun as a display of Trump's indignation, but it was quickly transforming into something else, a reckoning. And for the first time in a long while, Trump seemed to realize that he wasn't the one in control. The tension in the Mar-a-Lago press room was growing thicker with every passing second. The initial spectacle of Trump's rage had given way to something more precarious, a slow but steady dismantling of his carefully constructed narrative. The reporters sensed it. They had seen this before. They knew that when Trump blustered, he was at his strongest. But when he deflected, when he tried to pivot away from a question without answering it, that was when the real cracks started to show. The next question struck precisely at one of those cracks: had his treatment of Zelensky damaged U.S.-Ukraine relations? The room shifted slightly as the weight of the question settled. This was no longer about Saturday Night Live, no longer about some late-night comedy sketch. This was about real-world consequences, about a wartime leader desperately seeking support and a former U.S. president treating him with condescension. Trump scoffed, waving a dismissive hand, but the response was thin, almost hollow. He launched into another round of self-congratulation, rattling off moments where he had supposedly done more for Ukraine than anyone in history. He exaggerated, as he always did, listing off things that had been debunked, conflating his past policies with current events. He was trying to reassert dominance, to project strength. But the next question hit even harder. A reporter asked if Trump believed Vladimir Putin was laughing at the situation. The words lingered in the air, unspoken implications hanging alongside them. The Russian leader had long been accused of manipulating Trump, of benefiting from his reluctance to challenge Moscow. And now, after a widely mocked meeting with Zelensky, was Putin sitting back, amused, watching the fallout? Trump's demeanor darkened. He straightened slightly, nostrils flaring, as if the mere suggestion had struck a nerve. His response came quickly, faster than before, but it was more emotion than substance. He lashed out at Biden, at NATO, at the idea that anyone had been tougher on Russia than him. He repeated familiar lines about energy independence, about pipeline deals, about how under his leadership, things had been different, better, stronger. The reporters didn't buy it. The audience watching at home wouldn't either. His voice had begun to take on a strained quality, a slight edge of desperation seeping into his usual bravado. His attempts to shift the conversation were becoming more erratic, less controlled. Then came the moment that shifted the press conference from tense to outright hostile. A journalist brought up whispers of a possible congressional investigation, whether Trump's treatment of Zelensky, his remarks about withholding aid, and his broader stance on Ukraine could warrant scrutiny from lawmakers. The air in the room turned electric. This wasn't just about bad optics anymore. This was about legal consequences. Trump's face changed in an instant. The usual red flush of anger deepened, his brows knitting together as he struggled to process the question in real time. He hadn't expected this. He had prepared himself for media attacks, for insults, for the endless drumbeat of so-called fake news. But this? The idea that there could be an official probe, an investigation, real consequences for his words and actions? That wasn't part of the script. He tried to dismiss it outright, tried to make it sound absurd, but his voice cracked just slightly as he spoke. The press corps caught it. The cameras caught it. Everyone watching could see the moment his confidence faltered. His hands became more animated, chopping the air, pointing, waving in broad, exaggerated motions. He called the press dishonest. He called them losers. He ranted about witch hunts, about political persecution, about how they were all obsessed with him. He tried to turn the moment into a spectacle of defiance, but his voice had become shrill, his words spilling out too fast, losing coherence. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, and for the first time that evening, he looked like a man who wanted to be anywhere but where he was. The journalists knew it. The viewers at home knew it. And somewhere, behind the scenes, even his advisors were beginning to realize that this press conference had spiraled into something far worse than just an angry response to a comedy sketch. Trump wasn't just losing the room, he was losing control of the narrative. And for someone who had built his entire political career on controlling the story, that was the worst outcome imaginable. The room had shifted. It was no longer a press conference but a slow, public unraveling. Trump had started with fire and fury, ranting about Saturday Night Live, the media, and the deep state conspiracies he claimed were working against him. But now, he was no longer leading the battle, he was on the defensive, cornered by the rapid-fire questions cutting through his usual bluster. Then came the question that shattered what little control he had left. A journalist, seizing the moment, asked whether Trump's refusal to fully support Ukraine was helping Russia. The words landed like a thunderclap, forcing him to confront what had been implied all along. The murmurs in Washington, the criticisms from both sides of the aisle, the growing perception that his dismissive stance towards Zelensky was, in effect, a gift to Putin. For a split second, the air was still. Then Trump erupted. His face contorted in fury as he turned on the reporter, spewing an insult designed to discredit and belittle. The rage in his voice was raw, less performative than before, a knee-jerk reaction to the accusation that had hit too close to home. His hands slashed through the air, movements sharp and erratic, as he launched into a full-throated tirade about how no one had ever been tougher on Russia than him. The idea that he was aiding Putin was, in his view, not just an attack but an outright fabrication, and he made sure everyone in the room knew it. But his frustration was boiling over faster than he could control it. In the heat of the moment, he snapped again, this time letting something slip, something that immediately sent the press corps into a frenzy. He dismissed the importance of Zelensky altogether, downplaying the Ukrainian leader in a way that made his true feelings glaringly obvious. It took only a second for him to realize the mistake. His expression twitched, a flash of panic behind his eyes as the weight of his own words settled. The reporters caught it instantly. They knew what they had just witnessed, an unfiltered glimpse into how he really saw the situation. Cameras were rolling, microphones were live, and there was no taking it back. Scrambling, he backtracked, attempting to reframe his words, but the damage had been done. The room was no longer just questioning his stance, they were witnessing him lose control in real time. Desperation took over. He slammed his palm against the podium, the loud thud cutting through the chaos. His voice rose, cracking slightly as he declared himself the greatest dealmaker in history, the only one who could fix global conflicts, the master negotiator who had been unfairly targeted by the corrupt political establishment. His rant spiraled, touching on grievances that had nothing to do with the original question, bouncing between topics in a frantic attempt to reassert dominance. But no one was listening. The focus was no longer on his words but on his unraveling demeanor. Finally, he reached his limit. His voice strained, his composure in shreds, he made the decision in an instant. With an abrupt gesture, he declared the press conference over. His tone was final, but the reporters weren't finished with him. Questions erupted all at once, shouted over each other, demanding clarification, pressing on his slip-up, asking whether his remarks would be condemned by allies in Congress. He didn't answer. He didn't even look at them. Turning on his heel, he stormed away from the podium, moving toward the exit with stiff, hurried steps. His aides scrambled behind him, their expressions unreadable, some already reaching for their phones, no doubt preparing for the inevitable fallout. As he disappeared behind the curtain, the journalists remained in the room, their voices still filling the space, discussing the spectacle that had just unfolded. The headlines were already writing themselves. Trump had not just lost his temper, he had lost the battle. And outside, in the world beyond Mar-a-Lago's walls, the consequences of his words were only just beginning to take shape. The meltdown spread across the internet like wildfire. Within hours, news networks dissected every moment of Trump's press conference, replaying his outbursts, his slip-ups, and his furious departure. Clips flooded social media, each one highlighting a different moment of his unraveling, the podium slam, the wild hand gestures, the flushed face of a man desperately trying to regain control but failing spectacularly. The Saturday Night Live parody, which had originally sparked his outrage, suddenly seemed restrained by comparison. The real-life Trump had outdone the satire, delivering a performance so volatile that even his usual defenders struggled to spin it in his favor. Late-night hosts pounced, turning his press conference into a comedy goldmine. His botched attempt to dismiss Zelensky, his failed effort to pivot to Biden bashing, his frantic declaration of being the greatest dealmaker in history, all of it became fodder for relentless mockery. The internet responded with lightning speed, producing memes, remixes, and viral videos that further cemented the debacle as a defining moment of his post-presidency. Even conservative commentators, usually willing to defend him no matter what, hesitated. Some dismissed the press conference as just Trump being Trump, but others admitted he had handled it poorly. The optics, they conceded, were terrible. His angry dismissal of Ukraine's leader, his inability to counter the narrative that he was enabling Russia, his sheer lack of composure, all of it was a disaster for someone trying to position himself as the strongman America needed. Then came the polls. The numbers trickled in, and they weren't good. His approval rating took a hit, particularly among moderates and swing state voters. Independents, already wary of his approach to foreign policy, viewed his behavior as erratic and unserious. The gap between him and his potential general election opponent widened slightly, a small but significant shift in an already tight race. But the damage wasn't just political. Legal analysts began discussing the possibility of congressional scrutiny. His treatment of Zelensky during their real-life meeting, combined with his past history of pressuring Ukraine for political favors, raised questions about whether there could be further investigations into his handling of U.S.-Ukraine relations. The whispers of legal consequences grew louder. Was his dismissive stance toward Ukraine part of a broader pattern of conduct that could warrant official inquiry? Would lawmakers, perhaps even some Republicans, be forced to distance themselves to avoid being dragged into yet another Trump-centered scandal? The once theoretical conversation about whether Trump's arrogance and recklessness would catch up to him began to feel more real. The moral of the moment was clear. Trump had spent years operating under the belief that he could say and do whatever he wanted without consequence. He had mocked world leaders, insulted allies, and spun his own version of reality without regard for facts or optics. But now, as he stormed out of that press conference, his empire of bluster had started to crack. He had underestimated the power of perception. His refusal to admit mistakes, to acknowledge the weight of his words, had turned even a comedy sketch into a political liability. What had started as a rant about an SNL parody had spiraled into a full-blown political and media catastrophe. And this time, the consequences wouldn't be so easy to brush aside.